Thanks very much, John, and thanks for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and likewise, from my perspective in Glasgow, UCD School of Architecture has a very, very strong reputation, and particularly when you flick through the yearbooks, you get a real sense of what goes on in the school, not just in the finished work, but in the culture that exists through it. So the book's almost transparent in that sense, and it's a fantastically agile and fruitful place, I found. It's great to be here as well because for the first 3 months or so, as the new head of Mac, I've hardly been in a studio. And so the idea of sitting in front of students and talking about architecture is a real luxury. I'm hoping that's just the honeymoon phase that I'm going through. For me, the idea of place and the idea of placemaking is fundamental to architecture, the identity of places. And I think for me that in many respects is the DNA of architecture, you could say. And I'm reminded again and again about that in terms of experience in buildings. And in this photograph, which I took many years ago in Ethiopia, simply to try and capture what I thought was a very romantic scene of this little building in the landscape, big tree beside it, small church. In actual fact, in a way I suppose was presumed that the church itself, the building itself, was the main place, only to discover when I went up to it that in actual fact under the tree was this little school taking place. Interestingly, a school, having just talked about schools, almost in a sort of Lucan way, a group of people under a tree talking to somebody or listening to somebody, or in this case being whacked over the knuckles by some quite strict Orthodox priest. But the place was the space under the tree, not just the building. And so it was a great reminder that place crosses both the constructed and the unconstructed domains, and in a way that it crosses the man-made as well as the natural. And I suppose that fundamental activity of claiming a piece of landscape to either to live in or to have some sort of activity, just like this typical, as I think it's in Yorkshire, typical vernacular scene of objects in a landscape. It's such a fundamental part of what we do when we build. We tend to forget it. But for me, one of the interesting things about this sort of scene is not so much the formality or the formal sense of these objects in a landscape, interesting though that is, and also the way that it's built and all of that, interesting though that is. It's the ability for the building and the structure to say something unconsciously about the life that went into doing it. In this case, simple agricultural life in a particular part of a particular country. And that ability of architecture to speak about things apart from itself, I think, is a really, really interesting and also high aspirational aspect of buildings. Likewise here, this was the ruins of a house we worked on, or simply built a new house beside in Lewis, a place that is as physically and as culturally remote from mainland Scotland as you could get. Again, the idea that within this bleak landscape, somebody simply builds some walls and a roof to live in is such a sort of crucial fundamental part of who we are. And sometimes, regardless of whether that shelter is ancient or, for that matter, modern and contemporary, it's often a single space structure. I find that also interesting. It's an obvious thing to comment on in many respects, because when shelter is needed, the most fundamental thing is to just cover yourself in the simplest spanning devices, and that usually means it's a one space structure. But in actual fact, it's rather interesting because the more I'm in one space structures now, which isn't very often, but nevertheless when you are, particularly when you're on holiday, there's a sort of more relaxed component and experience in it. And I think that brings us back to our primitive roots, where architecture is essentially about shelter and containment. And I suppose the other component part of that is how that develops into settlement. I suppose that's the next component part. Even a settlement which has grown up as seemingly randomly, as this little stretch of Cranfield outside of Belfast. It's a sort of Irish Cape Cod series of little 1930, 1940, 1950 houses, just designed by a developer, strung along a beautiful beach, which don't have any architectural value in themselves, but nevertheless, as an ensemble, somehow work. And that sense of place that I talked about earlier exists not because they're grouped in a particular way, but because well, I suppose it is because they're grouped in a particular way, but not to enclose a space, simply because you're always aware of the ensemble at any one time. That doesn't always happen with groupings. The classic post-war suburb is more about the individual. So although there's as many, if not more, buildings in this case, and they're all probably something like that, there's no sense of being in a particular place. Every little building wants to be a mansion house, but can't. It's quite different from this kind of settlement, where a consistent application of a simple construction system and culture results in something that's delightful, that you feel affectionate for, you feel contained by, you feel that spatially it seduces you through the town, that it's not all about the individual. It somehow points, again, through the medium of what's been built to a life that's not been built, i.e. the community, the culture of that particular community. And not only that, but of course it does something spatially as well. We've tried that a few times as well, just in terms of taking even a couple of houses and grouping them together by walls and little outbuildings and screens that in some way try to extend that life beyond the limits of an individual building. And I suppose where we've built in the landscape, in a setting like this, we've tried in some way to pick up clues from that setting in order to inform the form and the design of the building. I don't find designing easy. Terrible thing to admit, but I don't find it easy, and so I'm always looking for clues as to how to get going. So grateful for an architectural idea when it comes. And so the context, whatever the context is, this is this house in Lewis, we really do try and interrogate that landscape for ideas about how we can inform that discussion with a client. And the trouble is that when we get that right, or what we think is right, and the building says something about that particular couple, a particular family, or even that particular setting, and diverts the attention from the architecture to something else, I can't tell you anything about that through a photograph, because while I say that this particular project is trying to engage with the wider landscape, or is bringing light in different ways, or it's trying to enhance something that's not the building itself, meanwhile behind me is a slide of that building saying, look at me, look at me, look at me, instead of looking out there, look at this, experience this. And that's the problem with designing buildings and then talking about them, particularly about this issue, which I find very fascinating. Likewise, these two buildings, again, crucially examining a particular place, trying to explore a particular couple's needs, as well as actually using tradition, a traditional model, to innovate as well. So we both take on board the traditions of the long, thin plan. Nevertheless, I want to talk to you about what it feels like in there, about how you experience that landscape and light in different ways. But I've got behind me a photograph of the building, and even a photograph of the interior wouldn't do it. So I find that interesting, and I find that challenging, because in a way it's one thing being able to have the context, have the place that you're building there in front of you in order to interrogate and develop clues like we were talking about this morning about all these projects. But when you're never going to go to that place, when you're designing, it raises quite important questions about what's the role of the architect. And as you can imagine with that slide behind me, the project I'm going to talk about today is one where we knew we wouldn't be going to see it or visit the site while we were designing. It was a competition, and it was in this continent here. Now, I've been in some countries in Africa. I've travelled quite extensively around Nigeria and Cameroon many years ago. I've been to Ethiopia a few times where I've got involvement with a very good practice there. But if I said, because of that, I know about Angola. That's kind of like saying, because I live in Scotland, I know about Sardinia or Bergen or somewhere else in Europe. It's just not the same. And that creates problems for the architect. What is it that we base, what is it are we allowed to base our ideas and presumptions on? So the project I'm going to talk about very briefly is in Angola, it's in Luanda. It's a competition to design low-cost, self-build housing, or a housing system, really, for a particular community. A system that would be able to create a house and also be built on and developed so that a settlement, a town, could be created from it. And so, bizarrely, the competition is called Patio and Pavilion. Now, Patio and Pavilion brings this image to mind for me. An object in a piece of ground surrounded by a wall. It's a sort of classic suburban or even rural situation. And the only reason, there was two reasons why we did the competition. One was because I'm interested in that kind of work. And secondly, because the main assessor was Alvaro Siza, and anything that Alvaro Siza is involved in, we thought it's not going to be very bad. And so we did the competition. But instead of being able to go and visit or even experience, I don't mean collect data about the temperature in Angola or anything like that, but data on the feel of the place as well as the people who are going to build, we decided we'd nevertheless make some presumptions on the climate and the fact that it would be for a poor and primarily rural-based community. We decided we'd start with construction rather than place, which is something we never generally do. And because we wanted to investigate a system or develop a system that was environmentally friendly, had longevity, could be repaired, wasn't importing materials, we started looking at bricks, timeless, ancient, as well as modern way of building, and particularly thin clay bricks. And we get very excited, in a way, I suppose, when we started to realise just how many countries have used bricks in different forms and how much potential an architect has. I think Alto described a brick as being this amazing modular system where it doesn't define the building, it gives you so much opportunity. But it raised in our minds the question of how do we go about doing this? And it's worth dwelling on this little diagram. This is a diagram that the architect I worked in, or whose office I worked in for a long time, Bob Maguire, from a very important English practice, Maguire Murray, put together, I think when he was head of Oxford Poly. The RIB have just published a book on their work. And it wasn't to try and clarify a design methodology, because he wasn't very keen on design methodologies, but he was trying to in some way articulate what actually happens when we design a building or we design something. And he just brought these two groups together at the top. What the architect brings, the problem as given, and the available data. And as he said, much of which we'll never know because it's an imperfect world. And it wasn't again to say this is the process, but just to highlight that we bring our own prejudices, life experiences as a designer, and that's quite important, as well as our insights and intuitions. And we have particular knowledge and skills, so that's a package that comes. And then the problem as given is as much to do with the people, the community that you're dealing with, the site and the context and the brief and the finance. It's another package, and out of that is the traditional brief. And then the third item is this data that occasionally will be discovered. And then he just described that that is, in some way, goes through some interaction process out of which an understanding develops. And that's a key point in the development of a project. And out of that understanding, and this is where the architectural skill comes in, an architect can produce an architectural idea out of that. And thereafter follows a developmental process. But it's quite interesting to dwell on that because it presumes certain things. It presumes essentially that you can get to those people and you can get to that place to learn. And in this case, we couldn't. So in many respects, our life experience, insight, and prejudices are the thing that to a certain extent influenced a lot of our moves. Of course, when you're a student, you're anaesthetised from clients and budgets generally, so quite often you jump, and indeed so do architects, jump to the idea without the understanding of the total problem. I've been in that situation myself, and that usually ends in tears at some point down the design process. So we get very excited about discovering this very thin clay tile system, which seemed miraculously to be able to create vaulted structures without means of formwork. And we just thought that this gave us some potential for both a low-skill self-build system, as well as a system that perhaps could be a spatio-structural system that gave us some flexibility, and also something that wasn't too prescriptive, it wasn't too product-related and too precise, and it was also culturally neutral. And we thought that was an important consideration in building for a very different culture and a very different climate. And of course, in seeing those images when we discovered them, we got very excited because, of course, we had things like this in mind about, Corb's villas, which seem to have this wonderful, seamless timelessness of a spatio-structural system which had a relationship between an inside and an outside, particularly in a country which is hot and steamy. And we were also excited by the idea that there could be some sort of humane Casbah-like experience in a tightly packed settlement rather than this disparate settlement that the patio and pavilion image seemed to suggest. And also excited by the possibility that one could create shady, well-ventilated, breezy, humane external spaces that people of any nationality in any country could simply populate and enjoy living outside, particularly in a community which probably was going to be agricultural, was going to be animals running around, and so on and so forth. So we developed this system, which was essentially a series of parallel walls, and from those parallel walls we inhabited it with lots of different types of spaces for all of the storage and sanitary and showers and toilets, and then vaulted it over with this clay brick structure in order to create a sequence of sheltered external and internal spaces. And we took the plan, we were given an area for each house, which was, I seem to remember, 20 by 10, and we argued that, in fact, we could do it in a 20 by 5 metre span, so that one little house could be like the one on the left-hand side, so that the very minimum you would build 2 walls and vault across. And then later on, you could add to that with perhaps an external space with gardens and places to plant. And then later you could vault some of that space so that you had this sequence of courtyards allowing lots of ventilation, taking things like toilets and water and things discreetly into the wall, and build up something that in fact gave territory and containment, as well as it were, a tool for others to build on. And this is the idea here. You can see where this brickwork then becomes hollowed out here, with various things. So there's a thick wall and there's a thin wall, and then these spaces are vaulted over at will and wherever somebody wants to do it, in order to create a sequence of external and internal spaces. So you could wander around in this house and have fairly open, relaxed spaces, as well as these contained spaces. And we built it all out of brickwork, at least in our heads. We thought we had fairly solid brick here, there would be no concrete used, we didn't have any idea of foundations, but we thought we'd have fantastically optimistic and think that we could do this. And then have this very, very thin, easily constructed vault above it. And the thing about that was that for us, it gave us a system that not only allowed us to build a flexible, adaptable and extendable dwelling, but it allowed us also to consider the idea of a settlement, so that this could become a building block which would then be developed and added and extended in order to create a sequence of public and private spaces. So, there were courtyards, there was places to dwell, there was the vaults. We were always aware that there was privacy as well as a decent climate. And indeed, in order to create a town out of it, instead of having a master plan, we reckoned that we could, to a certain extent, develop it in such a way that it could grow organically and create this sequence of small private spaces, small village-type spaces, bigger village-type spaces where other structures could place roots through it, and also a real character, which was like that little town in Germany I showed, which was created from a consistent quality of similar elements built up over a period of time, and crucially give dignity to a very, very poor community.